You know, what's so interesting, some of them are identical.
As we have explained in earlier segments of this series, the original people to live in Kemet didn't look like the residents there today. The faces of the pharaohs, their own written description of themselves as black people of the black land, and extensive research by scholars such as Dr. Asa Hilliard means the people we show you now may have had their descendants brought to the Americas as slaves. By now it's fairly obvious you can't talk about African American culture without having accurate facts about African history. But it gets hard to talk about contributions if no one knows what they are.
Have you ever studied Africa?
No.
No. Not at all?
No.
No.
But I have studied Switzerland.
Have you studied China?
No.
Have you studied Mexico?
Few Americans, black or white, realized the African continent had thriving city-states, trade routes, governments, and kingdoms before the Europeans came.
But information does exist which helps us understand African continuity with African American continuity. Books such as this by Richard Hall. In African Cities and Towns Before the European Conquest, Hall gives us pictures, documentation, and more specifically, information about African lifestyles, some of those habits and pieces of culture we see in African Americans today.
Salaga, Gayo, Segu, all large pre-European African towns. Some grew on the banks of the Niger River. Others supported populations of about 400,000, and this according to European accounts. West African market cities such as Janneh and Gayo were wealthy and prosperous, with residents buying and selling gold in 1596. Two of these towns were probably founded somewhere around 822 to 921 AD. Travelers from Europe and other places described the inhabitants as exceedingly rich, and the cities stood as homes for many doctors, judges, priests, and learned men. This type of praise also denotes a high standard of learning during what we call Europeans' Dark Ages.
When Europe was having its Dark Ages, there were no Dark Ages in the rest of the world. Africans was having an age of enlightenment, the Chinese were having an age of enlightenment, and the people of India was having an age of enlightenment. We have a tendency to take European terminology and stretch it across the whole world. But there were no comparable Dark Ages in the rest of the world until the European came.
Okay.
The European came out of his Dark Age and created a Dark Age for the rest of the world by the destruction of their civilization.
Again, accurate research supports these claims. Internationally respected author and African scholar Dr. Ivan van Sertima says, for centuries, Africans surpassed Europeans in many areas. He says as late as the 1800s, Europeans came to the Africans to learn advanced techniques in science, medicine, and antibiotics.
They also observed the cleanness with which they cut the abdomen. They observed how they collapsed the abdominal wall. They observed how they stitched. They observed also that the African surgeons with consummate skill used the cautery iron in such a way that they could stop internal bleeding during the operation almost instantly with minor tissue damage using the hot irons. And all this was brought back. It was described in great detail. It was drawn and brought back into Europe.
Again, give me the year and give me the civilization that used these advanced medical techniques.
This was observed by a team that went out towards the end of the 1870s. It's somewhere around 1878 that it was published in the Edinburgh Medical Journal. It was on the team Dr. Felkin from Britain and Scotland, a joint British-Scottish team. It was observed among the Banyuro.
Now, at the beginning of this program, we define culture as whatever you can learn. Using that definition, the ancient Africans were a very cultured people before the Europeans came. Learning and libraries held a great deal of importance to these people.
There were books, formal books, parchment, papyrus books, thousands of them along the Nile in the temples. At Timbuktu, you had formal books, bound books like we know books to be.
But how did all of this information get lost, and why did it happen? Psychologist Naeem Akbar offers this explanation.
We came to America as a free people. In order for us to become slaves, it was necessary to destroy our consciousness of ourselves as independent human beings. That process was one by which you begin to destroy and to degrade those things which give you your sense of identity, purpose, direction, and origin. And in the process of doing so, you create a slave mind rather than a freed mind. And a constant onslaught of misinformation about who the slaves were was done intentionally for the purpose of making the slaves submissive and subject to the leadership of those authorities over them.
Much of Africa's history is wrapped around the glory of her kings, from the kingdoms of Kemet to the majesty of Mali and Songhai. African history developed around documented men and women. It's a comment about the power of racism and Western education that we rarely hear about these people or their countries. Who were some of these kings and queens? Dr. John Henrik Clark is a living library of resources in this area.
We know that Ghana lasted until 1000s. In the last of its many great kings, Tenkameni was killed 2 years before the Muslim invasion, 1076. So that means Tenkameni lasted until 1074. He was known as the king who rode out every day, twice a day. He would ride out and administer justice one part of the day. And no one had to move from his presence until he was satisfied that justice had been done in his case. He would ride out at the end of the day with dogs with gold collars, horses better dressed than the then kings of Europe, in splendid regalia.
At this point, we should let you know a little about the geography of ancient Africa. Ghana didn't have the boundaries it has today. In fact, according to Dr. Clark, none of present-day Ghana was a part of ancient Ghana. Dr. Clark says the boundaries of ancient Ghana look something like this. Again, we need to realize these kingdoms governed millions of people and had wealth. Wealth usually denotes commerce. Dr. Rosalind Jeffrey says the ancient Africans may have come up with the world's first calculator system to handle their daily transactions.
The old system in the marketplace was to put these little digits in a pan, and you would have your client come to you, buying, purchasing perhaps little groupings of materials, a dozen of this or 2 dozen, etc. And meanwhile, someone takes away a dozen and this, that, and the other. Meanwhile, you're moving your disc around in a pan or in a basket. And so as you're moving around, they become your way of counting. So that modern society, we have our little hand calculator, right, with a little battery inside. And the old days, you know, ancient Mali, Ghana, Songhai, etc., they had a little basket where they were shuffling around little metal discs and at the same time, you know, doing their calculations this way.
As all worldly kingdoms do, Ghana began to decline. But as that happened, the neighboring country of Mali began to rise. Dr. Clark says Mali produced some of the greatest kings in world history.
After Sunday Atta, there was a servant king, Sakuru. And after Sakuru, the greatest of all the kings of Mali, Mansa Musa. And he came to power in 1306. In 1324, he went on a famous journey to Mecca and Medina because he was a Muslim. He spent all those years preparing. He took with him from 60 to 100,000 people, 50 hairdressers, and he only had his favorite wives.
How many of them?
Only the favorite wives went on the trip. They had 50 hairdressers.
Oh,
so you can guess how many wives were there. Now you talking about style. Now when we had it, baby.
Okay, so he left basically from northern Central Africa, is that correct?
Yes.
And then went all the way into Mecca.
Went to Egypt first, where he was crowned the great Caliph of the Western Sudan. I mean, it's equivalent to Pope.
Right.